Everybody, it's Rick Wilson again. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, and appreciate, excuse me, sorry about that. Appreciate you taking the time this afternoon. So I trust everyone is staying healthy and adjusting to the not so normal days that we're all facing. I'm excited to welcome you to this presentation from Avalara. We're going to be covering the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and how the various state and local governments and sales tax compliance changes and other related updates have been coming through. So before we get started, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. So first of all, the presentation is being recorded. So we'll be sending out a link to everybody in an email as a follow-up, probably tomorrow or Monday. And then if you have questions throughout the presentation, just go ahead and use the Zoom chat feature that's at the bottom, and go ahead and log your questions, and then we're going to go ahead and wait till the end of the presentation, and then we'll cover those then. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Kevin Anderson with Avalara, and I'll let him start things off. So thanks a lot, Kevin. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, Rick. And thank you guys all for jumping on the line today. Really appreciate taking time out of your schedule to jump in and learn a little bit more about sales tax and specifically how states are reacting to COVID. Just to give a quick agenda of what we're going to run through here today. First and foremost, we're going to start off just by giving a little context around why I'm speaking to you guys here. Give a little background on the relationship between Adler and Sage and our partnership there. Just to add a little color. From there, we'll dive into COVID and exactly what states or the different measures that states are taking to provide some relief through these times. And with the immediate response of states being put in place, the world of sales tax actually went through quite a bit of changes over the last couple of years. And so I want to make sure that we frame out exactly what those changes are, because they are still being enforced. So starting off in 2020, there were quite a few changes that are being enforced. So I want to make sure that that we're all on the same page there. And then we'll dive into some of the best practices in addressing those changes, and round out with some Q&A. So without further ado, jumping into, again, just adding a little color behind the Adler and Sage partnership. We've actually been partners with Sage since 2007, and there are actually over 1,000 businesses right now utilizing Avalara within Sage. And again, just to give a little bit of background, we are today talking about sales tax and sales tax compliance services. And so our role within Sage really is to bolster the Sage's native functionality when it comes to sales tax compliance, taking what is a pretty manual tool that does come with Sage and automating as much of that as possible, ensuring compliance landscapes, and really just fortifying that compliance moving forward. Now, with that being said, let's dive into some of the more interesting subjects. The first, wanting to address kind of the elephant in the room, if you will. Everybody is having to respond and make a whole lot of changes to their day in, day out life right now in the wake of COVID-19, and states have obviously are also responding in measure. And one thing that this does highlight is I'm sure that it's pretty common knowledge that the federal government came out when the states started restricting access, put in place shelter at home. The federal government responded by saying, hey, income tax is going to be deferred by 3 months. So now instead of tax day being April 15th, we're going to push that out to July 15th. And that's a pretty easy message, pretty cut and dry. The federal government also for business taxes has put in place some blanket terms there as well. When it comes to sales tax, and you're going to see this theme come up throughout our conversation, is that sales tax is regulated on a state-by-state basis. And so that is great for each state. They're able to put in place the rules that they want and put in place different stipulations, but it does make it pretty hard to track. And so I'm going to pull up here a couple specific responses by different states as far as how they are treating sales tax. And so we've got Alabama, Illinois, and Louisiana. Now, each of these states are actually, each of the states that are enforcing sales tax, they have the autonomy to put in place different measures at their own accord. And so in general, what states are doing is they're deferring payments. So they're doing very similar to what the federal government did with income tax by pushing out by 3 months. A lot of states are doing that, or taking some sort of that measure. And so they're taking what returns would have been due in March, April, and May, and pushing that out by a couple months. But the devil is in the detail, and so each state is putting in place different programs that are specific to their state. And so instead of pulling up 50 different blurbs that we could read through, because I'm sure that would be the most exciting part of your day, just reading through each state and how they're specifically responding to COVID. What Avalara has been able to do is put together a pretty intense and easily searched roundup of each state's response to COVID and what that really means for you as a business. And so we will be following up this webinar with this link, but you'll simply go to the link, open it up, and type in the state that pertains to you. And so you'll be able to see exactly how Louisiana or Texas or Michigan is responding to Corona. Now, we have also put together a very similar resource when it comes to worldwide compliance. And so if you do have any obligations outside of the U.S., you'll easily be able to look up those specific countries' responses. And the last resource that's going to be sent to you is if you want double verification for any of these actions taken by the state, you'll be able to follow our third-party reference just to get that double verification. Now, this covers really the immediate needs that are, or the immediate responses by states and the immediate action items that you and your teams are going to have to take in order to maintain compliance within while we're in the time of Corona. But what I'd like to transition or shift to a little bit is that back in over the course of 2018 and 2019, states had been putting in place new sets of laws surrounding sales tax and really creating new sets of laws into what could create the obligation for a business to establish and maintain compliance within their state. And I'm sure that some word of this has been circulated around before, but what states have been able to, or have been putting in place over the last year and a half, are called economic nexus laws. And these laws dictate that a business can create, or a state can create the obligation for a business to establish and maintain compliance in their borders, based not only off of physical presence, which has been the classic way of creating that obligation, but now simply based off of your economic activity within that state. And so these states are looking at the number of shipments that you sell into their state, as well as the gross revenue that you sell into that state. And if it's over a certain amount, that creates the obligation to establish and maintain compliance, just the same as if you hired a remote employee in that state or opened up a new warehouse there. Now, these laws states began enforcing these laws back at the end of 2018, and at the start of 2019, there were about 25 to 30 states that were enforcing these laws, and by the end of last year, all but two states that enforce sales tax have begun enforcing a type of economic nexus. So that's a total of 44 states that a business can create the obligation to establish and maintain compliance in, not based off of physical presence, but based off of the number of shipments and the amount of revenue that you're selling into those states. And I bring this up because one of the biggest businesses being affected by this are companies that traditionally are not dealing with sales tax. They are selling B2B or selling to exempt customers, and therefore, throughout the course of the business's history, you're in one state and you're maintaining compliance in that one state, and any sales outside of that state really hasn't been a problem because you're just selling into the next state, not having to collect or remit sales tax, and so that sale just goes on as easy as possible. Now, with the onset of economic nexus, instead of being able to decide to take part in an activity that creates an obligation in a new state, businesses are having to simply monitor. So it's a transition from deciding to expand your sales tax compliance footprint to now monitoring where you have created an obligation to maintain sales tax compliance, simply based off of your sales into new states. Now, before we move on, I do want to highlight that much like the response to Corona or to COVID-19, states are in charge of their own sales tax. And so each state is able to enforce sales tax laws the way that they see best fit. And so each of these 46 states, they are enforcing a different type of economic nexus. Now, in general, kind of some rules of thumb around this is that a state will put forth a threshold that a business will have to cross in order to create the obligation to establish and maintain compliance. So that could be they put forth a threshold of $100,000 worth of sales into their state, or 200 shipments, and any sales into that state before that threshold are considered tax-free. But then once you have crossed, that creates the obligation to establish and maintain compliance. And these thresholds are looked at over the year. But each of these thresholds can get a little bit tricky because states are able to enforce these laws as they see best fit. Each state does vary from the state next to it. And so I'll pull up a couple examples here. We're looking at three random states, and we'll look at just the differences between the thresholds, or the differences between the laws that these states are enforcing. So Colorado began enforcing back in June of 2019, and they have a threshold of $100,000 worth of sales and no transaction count. So you can sell as much as you want into Colorado as long as you don't cross $100,000 and you've not created an obligation to collect or remit sales tax. Now, one detail within Colorado's laws is that they do look at all sales. So whether that be sales to exempt customers, sales that are considered tax exempt because of the product that's being sold, any sale into Colorado, any revenue counts towards that threshold of $100,000. Now compare that to Tennessee over here in the far right, where Tennessee has a little bit different threshold of $500,000 and no transaction limit. So Tennessee, again, doesn't care how many shipments you're selling into their borders, as long as it's under $500,000. But as soon as it crosses $500,000, you then have created that obligation. But the difference between Tennessee and Colorado is that Tennessee is only going to look at your taxable sales. So that is any sales that are being sold to the end user or a non-exempt customer. And then just to float in the middle and kind of round this out, if we're looking at California, very similar threshold to Tennessee with $500,000 in no transaction. But when we're talking about the types of sales that count towards that threshold, we're only looking at products. And so you can sell as many services as you want into California, and those will not be counted against that $500,000. But any products that you sell, whether it be to the end user or to a tax-exempt customer, they will count towards that threshold. Now, this is just an example of 3 of these states. Each state has their own details around the thresholds and how they are enforcing these laws. And so one way that Avalara is trying to assist businesses today is that we have put forth a free sales tax assessment tool. And so this sales tax risk assessment tool, let me pull this up, is a link. You'll follow the link to the tool, and we'll simply be asking you a couple questions about your sales activity within all 46 states or any state that you're selling into, really. And as you're going through this survey, Avalara will be able to run your answers against the different laws that states are enforcing, and we'll be able to provide you with a heat map, if you will, of states that you have that are very likely for you to have created a new sales tax obligation in, and the states where further examination is required. Now, this is a great starting point to just understand whether or not sales tax if your sales tax compliance footprint is changing or is likely to change, and really if there is further investigation required. We will be following up this webinar with a link to this risk assessment tool, and so feel free to use that as you see fit. But one thing that I do want to highlight is that our risk assessment tool is very focused on economic nexus, and so we will be able to give you again that heat map of high priority states where you've crossed the threshold within that state. But that really doesn't cover the entire picture, because with the onset of these new laws that states are enforcing, none of the old laws went away. And so when we're looking at evaluating Nexus as a whole, all of the old laws of physical presence Nexus, whether you have property or employees in a state, click-through Nexus or affiliate Nexus, all of those still come into play when really getting a hard, fast list of the exact states that you have an obligation in. Now, that does leave kind of a question of what should I do? So we have a good idea of where we've created economic nexus. There's still a question of, do we have any new physical presence nexus? And the best next step is to work with either your SALT CPA, give them a call and say, hey, we're formally investigating our sales tax obligations, and we want to make sure that we're getting the whole picture, and we need to do a Nexus study. And you can work with them. They'll be able to give you a hard, fast list of states where you have an obligation to collect and remit sales tax. Or if you don't have a CPA or a tax attorney that you work with closely, Avalara is able to provide or is able to assist through this. We do have a tax advisory services team that you can work with, and we'd be able to formally investigate your entire sales tax obligation footprint. Now, at the end of this evolution, you'll have again, a hard, fast list of the states where you have an obligation to establish and maintain compliance moving forward. And what I'd like to do now is transition a little bit just to further exploring some of the best practices in addressing these changes. Now, before we dive into the best practices in addressing these changes, I'd like to just take a moment and better understand all the different pieces of maintaining sales tax compliance in general. And the first and foremost, which we've kind of beat to death over the last few minutes, is understanding exactly where you have that obligation to establish and maintain compliance through Nexus. Now, we've covered the new forms of Nexus, the old forms of Nexus, and really the best practices in finding out what that footprint is. And once you've done that, the next thing to best understand is of your product and services offering, how each state and each jurisdiction treats your product and service offering. If the actual products that you are selling or the services that you're providing, if those are considered taxable at the state level, each jurisdiction might treat these different products and services differently. A very easy example is shipping and handling. And so while North Carolina considers shipping and handling taxable as a line item, about Michigan or Nevada do not. And so while that's on your invoice, if it's being sold to North Carolina, you are going to have to provide a sales tax determination, be able to collect that, and then file and remit that to the state. Whereas if you're shipping to Nevada, there's no need for that. That sales tax determination should be calculated at zero. And so keeping that in mind for all of the different products and services that you offer. The next piece is, what rates are we supposed to apply? And I'm sure that everybody on the line is pretty familiar with having to take a rate table and upload that to the tax schedule within Sage, making sure that the zip codes are lined up and that everything is as up to date as possible. But with that being said, as you're expanding into more and more states, each of these states will have varying numbers of jurisdictions. Across the whole U.S., we have about 14,000 different sales tax jurisdictions, and unfortunately, they're not set up to align directly with zip codes or zip +4. Zip codes were created to get packages to the right spot. Sales tax jurisdictions having authority over sales tax rates and rulings were not created for the same function. And so there is some pretty glaring overlap between where some jurisdictions have authority, but under the same zip code as another jurisdiction. And so needing to make sure that you have the address that you're shipping to aligned to the exact correct sales tax rate is paramount. And that's all to get a accurate sales tax determination that you collect from your customer and you remit to the state. When it comes to exempt sales, the less cumbersome piece of exempt sales is being able to provide a $0 determination or non-taxable determination to your customer that is an exempt customer, track that sale, and be able to have that reporting around that transaction to provide to the state. The other piece of exempt sales, it's a little bit more difficult to track and to keep in mind, is that each of those sales will need an exemption certificate, a valid exemption certificate from that customer on file, so that in the case of an audit, the auditor can come in, ask you for the exemption certificates applicable to their state over a time period, and you have all of those ready to go and give them to the auditor so that they can then reference and ensure that each of those sales should in fact have a $0 determination. From there, you'll be able to run reporting and be able to get all of that consolidated data in one spot, so that you can then fill out the not only your internal records, but also fill out the return that needs to be filed and remit to the state. And lastly is just keeping track of all of this for, on average, suggested 7 years, so that in the case of an audit, it's easily recalled and given to the auditor to complete their functions. That's a whole lot of moving parts. There's a couple key pieces in there that do take just a whole lot of effort, especially when looking at this from expanding from 1 to 2 states into that of, or as you're thinking of this as your sales tax compliance landscape grows. And so one of the ways that we best recommend to address a growing sales tax compliance landscape is through automation. And so we'll dive in to a little bit of an overview of how sales tax automation functions, specifically within Sage. What I'm about to pull up is a model of how Avalara functions and how we interact with the different pieces of compliance. And so I'll pull this up right here. And just to give a little, just to define some of the things that we're looking at here today. Up here towards the top half of the screen, you'll see that there's an orange cloud with Avalara in the middle of it, and that's what represents Avalara's sales tax engine, as well as the admin console for your specific company. And down here towards the bottom half of the screen is going to be all the different pieces of compliance that we're interacting with, most importantly, your Sage instance. And the key to Avalara being able to automate and take a lot of the legwork to maintaining sales tax compliance off of your table, and also being able to bolster the native functionality within Sage is found through these two arrows. So this represents our integration into Sage. And we've had a certified integration into Sage since 2007, and actually for the last 10 years, Sage has, we've had an OEM relationship where Sage will actually white label our integration and our tax engine, and those are available to you as Sage Sales Tax Pro by Avalara. But really what these two arrows represent is the two-way communication between Sage and your Avalara admin console. And that way, whenever a quote is being created, a sales order is being processed, or an invoice is being committed, Sage is able to, or Sage knows to shoot the pertinent sales tax information over to Avalara so that we can run all of that information through our tax engine and provide a guaranteed sales tax determination right within Sage. Now, the look and feel of this, from your standpoint, is the exact same within Sage today as it was when you were relying on the tax schedules. When filling out when toggling between the different entry forms, the sales tax will come across, the sales tax determination will come across the exact same as it does today in Sage. It's just that what is being presented or being pushed back to Sage is now a guaranteed sales tax determination where provided by Avalara. Now, what we do pull, or what information is presented to Avalara, is the customer number, so that we know if it's an exempt customer or a taxable customer, the ship to and the ship from address, so that we can figure out exactly what jurisdiction has authority over that transaction, and then also the products that are being sold. So if there is any sales tax product taxability that needs to be accounted for in this determination, we'll be able to do so. So one thing that I kind of glossed over is that we do look at the customer that's being sold to. And what you're able to do is push all of your exempt customers from Sage over into CertCapture, so that we can bolster the exemption certificate management, exempt sale management of your company. And when you push over those exempt customers from Sage, and they're now populated within CertCapture, they will have the same customer account number or unique identifier that you're using within Sage today. But we now know that these customers need a valid exemption certificate on file. Now, Avalara is positioned, and one of the goals of CertCapture was to ease the collection process from these customers as much as possible. And so you can create a quick campaign where a email, fax, or or letter mail will be sent to these customers requesting a new exemption certificate. They'll also have a link that they can follow where they can fill out an exemption certificate on the fly. And all of those customers are then able to get back an exemption certificate. Once that web link is filled out and the exemption certificate is signed, that automatically populates back within CertCapture. So you now have a valid exemption certificate on file for that customer. So at the end of that evolution, you now have an audit-ready exemption certificate portfolio of your entire exempt customer base. Moving forward, one of the challenges that presents itself is exemption certificate management can often be a static management process or a reactionary. So in the case of an audit, you find out exactly what exemption certificates are invalid or which ones have expired and which ones are just plain missing. And you then have to, within the timeline of the audit, reach out to those customers and collect those exemption certificates as needed. CertCapture changes that process to a dynamic management system where we'll be able to provide active monitoring around any invalid, expiring, or missing exemption certificates that you would be able to use to reach out, again, using the easy-to-use web wizard to collect those exemption certificates and keep them on file for your customer base. And that way, when an auditor comes in, you can perform a simple search to collect all the exemption certificates that they need and provide that to them, easy as possible. The other piece is, since Avalara now knows exactly what or exactly which of your customers are exempt, whenever we are processing a sales tax determination, we'll see that they have an exemption certificate on file, that they are an exempt customer, and we'll be able to send back a $0 determination for that transaction. And once we have all that information, we've now established a audit-ready exemption certificate portfolio. We're providing the sales tax determinations on all of your transactions, and we're also determining your sales tax liability across the whole company. And we're determining that down to the jurisdiction level. Every jurisdiction that can have authority over that sales tax determination, you also have access to reporting down to that level of detail, and able to run one of 55 pre-configured reports that you can use for reconciliation. And since we have all that information on hand, we're also able to file and remit the returns on your behalf. And so we'll be able to fill out those returns on your behalf, pay the states on your behalf, and provide you with a copy of the return that was filed, as well as a confirmation of payment. All right, and those are the kind of the three pillars of sales tax compliance: the determinations, exemption certificate management, and filing and remitting returns, or remitting to the state. Now, the last piece that I want to cover with our time here today is that Adler, over the last 6 to 8 weeks, Adler has been fully aware of the COVID crisis that's been affecting all of us, and we really put to mind what is the best way that we can assist businesses that we work with, or that we're going to be working with soon, through these uncertain times. And one of the things that rang most clear to us was that cash flow for businesses right now is of the utmost priority. And so Avalara has put forth a COVID response program that I want to run through the details of right here. And so from now until June 30th, anybody who partners with Avalara will receive the initial 3 months of our project will be with no payment. And after those first 3 months, or those first 90 days, the actual annual subscription will begin at that point, and you will not have to renew until a year from, or 15 months from signing, effectively. And so that way, able to able to ensure that your teams have projects and are able to stay at work, being able to hit the ground running once we get on the other side of this of COVID, and once things start to normalize and speed back up, being able to have your sales tax compliance processes down packed, and then also any usage that you accrue through these first 3 months, that gets wiped clean. So effectively, you're starting with a brand new subscription in 3 months, so that you can again hit the ground running once things are normalizing. We do have a link down here at the bottom of the page where you'll be able to follow and get a little bit more of detail around this. The COVID program. If you do have any additional questions, also you can feel free to reach out and ask me. All right. So with that, I think it's a good time for us to start or to jump into any questions that might have come up over the course of the presentation.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. This is Rick again. One thing before we jump into the Q&A, I just wanted to, I noticed there were some non-Sage users of Martin Associates on the call, but so, you know, Avalara works with other ERP systems that we support, such as Acumatica and Dynamics GP. So just wanted to, yeah, just wanted to say that. So everything that you heard is basically all the same.
Unfortunately, you won't be able to work with me, but I'll get you in front of the right people. Not a problem.
Good point. Good point. So I did have a couple of questions that came through here.
All right.
Let's see. Says how. Well, let's go with this one. How do states find out my business is out of compliance if I don't have a physical presence there? How do they know?
Yeah, that's a great question. It took me a while to wrap my head around it as well. And you know, the core of this is, if I'm not physically in another state, how will they ever find out that I'm doing business there? The most common route that businesses will use is that they will use an audit of another business. And so as they're auditing a business that is in their state and you've sold a lot to them, they'll see, okay, there's a lot of activity here that, you know, whether you cross the threshold in those sales, or if, you know, you have a significant amount, and go, all right, well, they're probably not the only customer in this state. We're going to put you on a short list. Gotcha. The other very common method that states will use is that they'll look at, so they'll run a report of all businesses that are registered for sales tax, and they'll run a report of all businesses registered for income tax, to pay income tax. They'll cross-reference those, and any business that's not on both lists gets put on a short list for the type of tax that they're not registered for. The last one, and this one, yeah. Oh, and the third is that they do have bots that are effectively just looking at aggregate data and running through it and looking for business names.
All right, interesting. Let's see. There's a question here: is the free assessment tool a formal Nexus study?
Yeah, and that's a great clarification to make. Our free assessment tool only looks at economic nexus. And so again, with the onset of economic nexus, as states are enforcing these new laws, none of their old laws went away. And so they are, none of the old laws are going away. And so there is a chance that your business has created an obligation through one of the older laws, and it just didn't get caught whenever that happened. And so the risk assessment tool is really positioned more to better understand if economic nexus is something that is going to be affecting your business. A formal nexus investigation would be a bit more of a deep dive into all the different versions of nexus or of obligations that you could have created. And that's really why the best step, if there are more questions than just economic nexus, is to get a hold of your CPA or to perform some form of formal nexus investigation, a formal nexus study.
All right. There's one on here. Does Avalara set up automation in our system for us?
Yeah. So when thinking of an IT project, and because Avalara and Sage are talking to each other, and we need to have that free flow of information, it is going to be an integration into your Sage instance. So it is an IT project, getting everything set up and making sure that everything's working correctly. Avalara has different levels of support and different levels of implementation services. And so part of our conversations, if you know, when investigating sales tax automation, is really understanding what level of support and implementation services that you and your team would need, and would put you in the best position to get an Avalara up and running and automating sales tax moving forward.
Okay. Yeah. And of course, we'll always be here to help you as well, along with the Avalara team. So that's all. Betsy, did you have any directly in the host that might have slipped in?
No, I don't have any.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's it. So to respect everybody's time here, I guess we'll wrap up. Kevin, thank you very much. Great presentation.
Well, thank you guys.
Yeah. And
perfect.
Yep, as I mentioned, we'll be sending out follow-up emails to the folks that registered and attended with a link to the recording here. So along with the information about the promo, and we'll go from there. So thanks again for everybody's time and taking the time out of their afternoon. We really appreciate it. Hope it was worthwhile, and we'll talk to you again. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
All right, have a good one.
Yeah,
Talk to you guys soon.
All right, yeah, bye.
Bye.